pin it.
Hello, everybody. We are live on ROKFIN right now. We are not live on YouTube. Why? Because I've been suspended for almost a week. So if you happen to watch a clip of this on YouTube, a safe clip on YouTube, which I got to tell you guys, as many of you are already aware, it's getting harder and harder to talk about pretty much anything on YouTube that is even somewhat controversial. And controversial is a relative term. So is rebel, because as it turns out in Canada, you don't really have to do much to be a rebel. Am I right, guys? Let's go to our first topic here, after feminism, which is Cambridge MPP Belinda Karahalios ejected from Ontario legislature. I'm going to let you kind of give me the backstory on this, but if I could summarize and tell me if I get this wrong, you had COVID. I even remember emailing with you when you had COVID, and you come back to work, you have a negative test, but they say, sorry, a negative test doesn't matter. It's a 90-day, I don't know what you would call it, not necessarily a suspension, but you're not allowed in for 90 days. They eventually just kick you out because you refuse to go, and they're not even letting you participate virtually. Did I sum that up correctly?
Yeah, pretty much. So I got COVID. I got the COVID-19 in November. I think it was the 19th as when I had tested positive on 2 rapid antigen tests, because the rules of the Ontario legislature is either show me that you've been fully vaccinated against COVID-19 or show proof of a negative rapid antigen test. So I refuse to disclose my vaccination status publicly. I think it's no one's business. So I just don't disclose it. So I went the route of doing the negative test. So I was going twice a week, went to my local pharmacy on the 17th, which is a Wednesday, because I had a question in the legislature on the Thursday, and the test came back positive. I was feeling okay. So the pharmacist said, you look fine. You seem fine. Let me test again. Tested again, came back positive. So then at that point, I had to get a PCR test. So Friday, the 19th, got the PCR test done. Very uncomfortable. And the nurse there was saying, oh, you seem fine. I'd be surprised if it came back positive. Lo and behold, Saturday, I get a call from public health. Yeah, it's positive. You got to quarantine. Fine, not a problem. So did my quarantine. I was really lucky. Fairly mild. It ended.
Can I interrupt you there? How long was your quarantine?
10 days.
It's just like, it's not like, that's not a day or two, a week and a half of quarantine. Just so everybody out there appreciates, the government calls you and says, you got a quarantine. Did they say that you had to isolate from your kids, from your kid?
I can get into all this. So, I mean, and let me just say, like, they were very, very kind. They were very kind.
One you got was very kind. The one I got a week later was not very kind.
Okay, but the 3 nurses I spoke with were very kind. So once I got my positive test on the Wednesday, we all stayed home. So we were, we stayed home. So when they called, they said, and I was trying not to be funny about it, but she says, can you use a different bathroom and sleep in a different bedroom than your husband? And I said, yeah, that's fine. We can do that. And then she says, if your husband wants, he can go to one of the quarantine hotels and stay there if he wants to feel safe. And I said, pardon? And then she said, well, if he doesn't want to do that, it's fine. He should probably make all the meals. And I said, well, this is a great deal.
I told Belinda to tell them we were going to create a brick wall in the house, like inside the house, a brick wall. We're going to live on either side, but you didn't tell them.
No, I didn't tell them.
Do they really think that you haven't exposed each other at this point? I guess that's the curious.
But well, Allison, it's going to get worse, because I think I know where it's going with Belinda and Jim, because the quarantine for a non-testing positive is even longer, unless I'm mistaken, because once you have it, they have a time frame within which you're a danger. But if
correct.
You didn't get it, Jim, then you have to wait a longer period before you.
Right.
So, and the example, so we have a 5-year-old, as Jim mentioned, and he's attached to me still. Like, I love him. And so the nurse was like, oh, can you separate your son? I'm like, no, I can't. Like, I'm not going to traumatize them. And
they wanted me to stay away from him too. So when he's running in the room, show me the Lego, I'm supposed to tell my son, get away from me, COVID. And we're not doing that. That's crazy.
So of course, so she's like, well, if your son doesn't show, are you going to get him tested? I said, I'm not getting him tested. He's 5 years old. She goes, does he have any symptoms? At that point, he didn't. And so she said, well, if he doesn't show any symptoms and you don't get him tested, once your quarantine is over, he now needs to stay home for an additional 10 days. So he was going to be home for 20 days from school.
And I was quarantined for 20 days because I had your 10-day quarantine, and then I got diagnosed a week after I got sick.
Right.
You did 10 days. So I was like 3 weeks.
He was like 3 weeks. And so had Victor, and Victor did get, sorry, I shouldn't say his name. He did get sick, and like his COVID was 12 sneezes in a span of 24 hours and, a headache for 20 minutes. Like that was thankfully that was it for him. So had he not shown symptoms, he would have been quarantining for my 10 days, Jim 10 days, and then his own 10 days.
Right?
So at least he had symptoms. The minute he started sneezing, I called public health. I'm like, he's got symptoms. I'm not testing him. So they started him right on that day, which is great. So he's back to school. I'm happy. He's happy. Everything's good. But
do you have any idea what the science is that they are reasoning for that 30 days of
it's the incubation within, if you've been exposed, you could develop symptoms within 10 days. If you have it, your symptoms are over in 10 days. So you're almost better to get the symptoms and get positive diagnosed, because otherwise you wait the 10 days to see if you develop symptoms. And if you do develop them, then you got to wait 10 days for them to, go get over the COVID.
I see.
And on my call with public health a week later, I started asking some questions. The first one was like, how'd you get my number? The second question is, where are you calling from? Because on the call display, it doesn't say public health. So I don't know who this person is on the other line. I don't get a name. I don't think she gave me a name. I was pretty sick though. And then you asked like 2 or 3 questions, and the response I got was, why are you being rude? I'm just doing my job. It's like crazy. Like, you're calling me, inquiring, what do you do for a living? And I said, why do you need to know what I do for a living? I work from home. Like, that's what you should be asking me. Do I go to an office? And it was very strange.
I got the similar call at one point. It was over 2 months ago, I think, because our kid at school, there was a case in the class. So I get a call out of the blue, no caller ID, says they're from the government and they're here to help. And then says, someone in your kid's class with whom your kid has come in close contact tested positive. So you need to isolate your kid. And I said, first of all, how did you get my number? And they said, well, the school gave it to us. And it's like, that's already a bit of a violation. I said, and then they start asking me questions. What do you do? What school does your kid go to? What school does your kid go to? And I said, well, you got called from the school. Why do you need me to tell you that? And then I realized, as I'm getting progressively more and more impatient, they have my address, they have my number, they know my kid's school, and they could send over whomever they want to make sure. They said, isolate your kid. I said, I've got 2 other kids. Am I supposed to isolate the kid from the other kids? It's like, well, do you have a separate room? And then I was biting my tongue not to say what I thought. But it was all 4-letter words.
My husband is in the chat and he says, so they dictated what you do in your own home. That is not freedom. If I am home, I am not staying away from my wife. But Lynn, since you're watching, did you hear that Jim was also told by the nurse to make dinner? So I'm just throwing that out there. Okay. All right. So
dinner's got to be edible, right? So, and the barbecue is a little too cold to barbecue when you got COVID. So,
and by the way, not just like, I did a video, a bunch of them on it about a year ago when in the Peel region of Ontario, Jim and Belinda, you'll know what I'm talking about. They were giving advice on isolating children and put them in a room, slip food under the floor, give them an iPad, they'll be happy. And you had people on Twitter, whether or not they're real tweets, saying, I hear my kids sobbing in the other room. It's been 5 days. My heart is broken. They're effectively asking you to do nothing less than abuse your child. And they think they have the authority and even, the potential repercussion power if you don't do it. Over the top.
So one of the fascinating things that I found, just to go full circle, is, in politics, you can mail someone through Canada Post, right? You can get Canada Post to mail an entire riding or a walk route, right? With a mailer or a letter. And there's other ways to get people's addresses to mail them a letter. And there's a segment of the population in Ontario, when you mail them something, well, how was my privacy breached? How did you get my address to mail me a letter? But when they get a call from public health and public health knows everything about you, they're fine with it. Like, it's like, that's okay. Well, if the government has my phone number and they call me up and I don't know who the person is calling and they're asking all about me and where I've been for the last 2 weeks, that's okay. And I find the contradiction fascinating, in where some people apply what they call privacy to other things that they don't call privacy.
It's for the greater good, Jim. It's for the greater good. And if you don't do it, you're a selfish extremist right wing.
Right wing.
Mark my words. Oh yeah, go ahead, Viva. Sorry.
No, it's only going to be to explain what the new blue party is, and explain the difference. I know people are watching may not appreciate the differences between provincial and federal parties and what the new blue party is, in order to explain.
But quickly, we didn't finish the story. So
okay.
What happened?
So my quarantine ended on midnight of the 29th of November. So I got a great email from public health saying, hey, your quarantine is done. You can resume normal activities and you don't need to test
go back to work.
You don't need to prove that you're negative to go back to work. Great, right? And this is good for 90 days because, you could potentially, there could be a false positive with these tests. So pharmacists even in Ontario won't test you if they know you've been positive within the last 90 days. So I send that to the Ontario legislature and they're like, well, the rules are you have to show a negative test or you have to show proof of vaccination. Okay. So I get a rapid test. I do the test. It comes back negative. And so I present that at the door. And so the peace officers of security, they're like, okay, come on in. So I enter the precinct and I get into the legislative chamber. And the speaker calls me out.
And you're getting ready to ask a question because it's your turn to ask a question.
I have a question that day. So I'm ready to hold the Ford government to account. And, basically saying, he says, unvaccinated people like yourself. Well, I never disclosed it. So I'm not sure where he's getting his news from.
So he's using it like a slur.
Yeah, essentially like a slur. And he says that I stood up and I said to him, I'm not in contravention because your rules state this. And I presented a negative COVID test. But to him, to the wise speaker who has access to science beyond our knowledge, apparently, if public health says you shouldn't be testing for 90 days, that means you can't test. And even if you test negative, it's not valid because you shouldn't be testing. So I got removed
because he changed the rules. So the rules were a negative test or show the passport, COVID passport. She shows a negative test, but for Belinda, they changed the rules to say 90 days she can't go. Negative test, nothing. And it was amazing. It was
did they ask the police? Did they use the police force to escort you out?
So yeah, the sergeant at arms. She's like the head of the protective unit, the legislative protective unit. So I sat in my seat because I have every right to be there. And he called me and he asked me to leave two, 3 times. And he named me. And at that point, I had to leave. So she comes up and she, walks me out, and she felt badly about it because, she's just doing her job. But the good thing that came of this is you see the ridiculousness. Like there's literally no science behind his decision. And I spoke to a public health nurse the Friday before, and she said to me, she says, if you had booked a flight, let's just say, right, you booked a flight, and you got COVID and then you recovered and you got this piece of paper that I got from public health and the airline's rule says you need to show a negative test to board. The public health letter that I got trumps all these rules and says, no, I'm okay. I don't need to test. I can still board my flight.
We will get to the rest of this video in just 1 second, but before we do, don't forget the holiday clock is ticking, and what better gift idea that allows you to support my work and free speech while also having a robust glass of Malbec and a piping hot cup of coffee. First, check out Allison with 1lwinepromo.com. You get 50% off some of my favorite high altitude Malbecs from Argentina, and one even comes from the oldest vineyard in Argentina. Plus, you get 50% off shipping. They pair very well with the desserts you will be having with grandma while you debate all of the hottest topics around us right now. Or, speaking of hot, have a hot cup of coffee with twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, also with 1L Allison. These are high altitude shade grown USDA certified organic Nicaraguan roast. The CEO and founder of the company lives right there in Nicaragua where they grow, harvest, and roast the beans. There's also a Caturra tea. If you're a tea drinker, this is tea that you make out of the coffee fruits. You can have it hot or cold. I like to cold brew mine for 24 hours. Both options, the hot or cold, very good, as are the coffees, as is also the wine. So check out my sponsors and toast to free speech wherever you are this holiday season. Can we just go into more detail about how you also got kicked off of your party? I know you brought it up, but can we go into a little bit more detail of what Bill 195 was and what happened with that?
Yeah. So at the time, I was still with the PC Party of Ontario, and I was the parliamentary assistant to the Solicitor General. So she's the minister responsible for that bill, Bill 195, the Reopening Ontario Act. We like to call it the lockdown bill. And so the parliamentary assistant is kind of like a junior minister role. So, you support your minister. When you're a parliamentary assistant, you support your minister. And so when this bill was presented, and I read everything. Like every time legislation comes through, I'm reading, I cross-reference. I'm not a lawyer, but I do it. And so this bill was just dreadful. And I remember speaking to the ministry staff and to her and trying to talk to the premier's office, but they were avoiding me every chance I got. saying like, this is not a good bill. Like if any other party put this through, you guys would be gnashing your teeth and pulling out your hair. And, because the bill allowed for the government to declare the state of emergency finished, but to maintain the emergency powers. And that allowed for them to make decisions without any debate, without any vote. So, that's a big problem. We live in a democracy, where the government should not be making these decisions that affect all 14.5 million Ontarians just because, they want to do it. So in the PC party, all the votes are whipped, meaning you're told how to vote, which again, doesn't sit well with me, right? You should be able to vote how your constituents want you to vote. So this was a whipped vote. You had to vote in favor of this bill. And I was not okay with it. So the day came to vote for the bill, and I voted against it. And I walked back to my car, and I started to drive home to Cambridge. And Jim, I got a call from the House Leader's office and someone else, and I wasn't picking up the phone. I was like, no, like this was the right thing to do. So then Jim calls me, and he's like, "Did you hear the news?" I said, "No, what happened?" He goes, "Well, apparently you got kicked out." I said, "Oh, okay." So I turn on 680 News. That's like the local,
Oh man.
And
that's Siret's channel, right?
680. I was in Toronto. That's like the all news all the time.
Okay.
This station, but Siret is fantastic, and everyone should listen to him as well. So it turns out I got kicked out of the PC party for voting against Bill 195. And then afterwards they kicked out like
right, and then party staffer. They had a party staffer call our constituency president, who's now on our board running the New Blue Party with us, founded the New Blue Party, and start threatening them. Like, and Viva, you might know this. Like, are there laws against duress? Like, can I sue someone in Ontario for?
I would defer to my brother, but who's an Ontario lawyer. But my question is this: you're an elected member. How do they boot you, despite the will of the constituents who democratically elected you? Like, what's the internal party policy that says, despite being elected, we can boot you if you defy the party policy?
They actually don't care about their internal party policy.
Right.
Like they have a constitution which they really don't follow. I mean, like going back to that convention that Jim talked about in 2018, where they rigged it. My former PC colleagues were coming up to me saying, "I support your husband. My riding a board supports him. We're not allowed to vote for him." They even sent around a paper saying the PC caucus members that support you voting for this other individual, and they listed them, and half of those MPPs did not agree to have their name on that, and they littered it everywhere. Like it was just so
it's a propaganda
disgusting.
machine. But like Viva, they don't have any rules on this. In provincial politics, the Doug Ford's party doesn't follow their party constitution, and when they kicked her out of the caucus, the MPPs didn't even vote on it.
Yeah. Like
the premier just decided, and the MPPs just sit there and they just shake their head. Can you imagine voting in favor of that bill that Belinda voted against? You're a MPP, member of provincial parliament in Ontario, getting paid by the taxpayer to go and argue your principles and represent your constituents. And the premier says, you're going to vote in favor of this law that says I, the premier, can make up the rules on COVID for the next year, and you don't get a vote or you don't get a say in any of the rules. And they all go there and they say, sounds like a good idea.
Well, yeah, it's a good idea. It's a good idea for the government. And bearing in mind that at the time they're passing this, Jim and Belinda, you're a year and a half into how far into COVID are you, where they've already been abusing of their emergency powers to not pass any of these health orders through the legislative process? It had been a year and a half.
No, not even. It was St. Patrick's Day of March 2020 that
so right at the beginning.
It was like,
4 months
like 4 months in.
Yeah.
And they're like, we gotta be able to do whatever we want. And like, you should, I'm sure you know, like all the vaccine mandates and the mask mandates and just all this nonsense they're putting through. And like, they can't justify what they're doing with any type of real science. It's just,
Belinda was the only member of provincial parliament, the only politician in Doug Ford's party, current or former, that voted against that bill. And in Canada, she's the only politician who lost her position in a party for voting against a COVID-related lockdown piece of legislation. Like others followed in Ontario that spoke out about it after approving voting in favor of that bill, and they spoke out and they got kicked out. But she's the only one. She saw it like so early. I remember she called me that day or messaged me, and she said, first she said, I'm thinking of voting against it. And I'm like, okay, do what you got to do. They're not going to kick you out 2 years before the election and make this a big show. like to my surprise. I thought there was a chance they were going to kick her out like right when the campaign started in 2022, like pull a fast one on her. So I had my head on that, and I was talking to people about that. But I said, they're not going to kick you out for one vote 2 years before the election, where we have time to like decide what you're going to do. And she's saying to me, I think I'm going to vote against it. And I said, just vote for it. And then I was shocked.
Yeah.
Like these guys.
I was like, I brought in the bill. I'm like, you got to read it, cross-reference it. And it was just like, he was shocked. He said he was just shocked because like
you end up with this situation that's going on in New Brunswick, where you're back to level 1, the green zone, but the green zone is a absolute disastrous red zone in ordinary times. Like in New Brunswick, green zone level 1, still mandatory face masks, mandatory social distancing, and the unvaccinated are being recommended to be excluded from grocery stores. That's the most level of freedom in New Brunswick. I mean, that's what you get. That's what you got yourself into.
Belinda had the foresight, because I didn't read the bill, and most of the talking heads in Ontario at the time, no one said anything about this bill. And Belinda's reading the bill and she's telling me this is what it says. I'm like, come on, like there's no way it says what you're telling me. She's like, yes, and this is what's going to happen. Like Doug Ford can wake up one morning and say, I'm sending police to parks to give parents tickets if their kids are not wearing masks. And then the next day wake up and say, oh, I made a mistake, I changed my mind. Like, that's not how legislation, babe, I'm a lawyer. That's not how legislation is made. And she's telling me that's what the bill says. And I'm like, okay, then vote against it. And sure enough, she was right 100%. 100. I don't know how she had the foresight, and shame on me spending all that time in law and not reading the bill at first. And she figured it out, and she knew where we were going. She had the foresight, and she voted against it. And others followed after the fact, but she led by example. She led the way, and we're getting ready in June to defeat these guys in as many constituencies as possible.
Any final thoughts on Canada and where you all are headed? Oh, I did want to ask. You guys are supposed to get some big announcement or something today about COVID policy.
International travel. They might impose a 14-day quarantine on returning travelers or foreign peoples, even if they're double vaccinated, from what the murmurs on the street are.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I looked at the announcement. I know that the most recent one was about long-term.
Okay. Sorry. I just got a text. It's that restriction is not in place. No fake news coming out of me. It says, seems like it was a false call. Travel advisory for international, but no rule changes. Oh. Thank goodness for small blessings.
Take what we can get, right? Take what we can get.
So it's just a matter of time. They've it's like, what was that episode when Bart Simpson becomes the police and he's like, I tasted the power and I like it. This is the government has never tasted unquestioned, all-encompassing powers that they've been drinking from this fountain of power for the last 2 years. They're not going to stop drinking anytime soon.
And the last year and a half, every time we get some publicity or we challenge them and we rally the grassroots to call the government, MPPs, they back off and they move to the right. And Doug Ford comes out and he sheds a tear and he says, I didn't mean it, and it's going to be temporary. And then every time they come out with some actor who's distracting, some actor who says they're going to fight COVID and makes a mess of the whole thing. Or like when they kick Belinda out for 90 days, it's not a coincidence. Like 3 days later or a few days later, Doug Ford comes out and he says it's indefinite now, COVID. A couple months ago or a month ago, when Belinda led the charge against this mandatory vaccine bill on education and healthcare, and we rallied and the government shot down that bill, the next day Doug Ford came out and said, oh, we're going to get rid of masks in January and in March. And then like a few weeks later, they banned Belinda from the legislature. He comes out, he changes his mind. So there's no stability. There's no logical explanation for how they're going about this stuff. And we want to do a different approach in Ontario and push for getting rid of these vaccine passports, getting rid of these masks, and pushing monoclonal antibody treatment. There's a doctor at St. Joe's in Hamilton, Ontario, who's finally brought it. He fought with the government for months to get monoclonal antibody treatments to patients with COVID in Ontario. And he's only treated 50, Viva, 50 out of a population of 14 million. They're using it in Florida. They're not using it here. And I think it's by design. And we're going to push alternative solutions to this.
From your mouth to God's ears. I mean, I just listened to Peter McCullough's interview, his podcast with Joe Rogan.
Yeah, I'm happy.
My wife is a postdoc neuroscientist who understands a bit of science, and the discussion that there was no prevention, there was no treatment. It was go home and come back when you're on death's door, and by that time, nothing's going to work, regardless of whether or not it would have worked 10 days ago. And monoclonal antibodies, as he explained, I'm not going to get into the I word or the other one there, the HCQ one, but all of this idea of they're sending people home saying, let your body fend for itself. If you're obese, if you have preconditions, go home, cross your fingers, and when it becomes so sick, come and die in the hospital. And that's what they've been doing. It's the same in the States, an egregious policy failure.
Yeah.
And Godspeed in what you're doing, Jim and Belinda. It's amazing stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you can't talk about it either. That's the other problem too. Like there are doctors out there who have been on the front lines of talking about early treatment, like Dr. McCullough or like some of the others that I've had along with Dr. McCullough on my channel. And you can't get the word out, even if people want to find doctors like them, because you get suspended from your YouTube channel or whatever other account.